Oh, lovely. And thanks a lot for giving the opportunity again here to present and to summarize about what was done this morning during the sessions. And I think the first I would like to express as my gratitude to all the presenters and all the work being done, because what we have seen is quite a few of efforts being done already at the OECD level, but as Maria was presenting in the end, also in the pre-OECD level, and now being in discussion with OECD about some SPSFs and some of the new activities, projects being then submitted to the OECD. And this not only means a lot of work what we have done, but it is also a lot of work which is upcoming then at OECD level. And that means that we have to have that in our mind in the future as well, to get that well coordinated and in a manner that it's manageable and not overflowing all the people being active at the WPMN, WNT, or at the OECD. So with that, the summary is pretty easy. I will not go into very much details. There was a very good overview of all the OECD activities of NanoHarmony, Go4Nano, and RISCON. And we will have an open discussion. Just for you, a slide which was already presented in a way by Eric in his presentation of Go4Nano. This is a slide we produced together with NanoMet, as well as with some of the other partners and the Nano Safety Cluster, where we actually collect and try to keep an update on the activities of actually what is ongoing at the OECD level. And as you see, the 4 sections: physical chemical properties, effects on biotic systems, environmental fate and behavior, and health effects. We see that we have some 4 projects coming from Go4Nano, as was introduced and already said. Just for you as a reminder for the open discussion: the volume-specific surface area, the accumulation potential of nanomaterials in biological matter, the guidance on environmental abiotic transformation of nanomaterials from Austria, and the applicability of key event-based test guideline 442D for in vitro skin sensitization. Then we have 3 projects which already were discussed quite heavily, and especially the dustiness was mentioned, which are all in Go4Nano and in NanoHarmony, with specific different tasks or parts of the developments of the guidance documents or test guidelines being in preparation. It should be mentioned that, for example, even though it is said here, test guideline on determination of the dustiness of manufactured nanomaterials, that this may not be only one test guideline, but also some other documents related to exposure assessment, as you heard this morning, as well as to the ETEX, to the explosivity of use for explosivity assessment. So this may not only mean one test guideline, but some more, and that this is quite some effort, and that there is a lot of discussion necessary. You also heard during the presentation on solubility and dissolution rate, which is not only within this test guideline, but which is also related to a lot of different test guidelines. Toxicokinetics was mentioned, the environmental transformation was mentioned, and there are others interlinked to it as well, and where we have to have a cross look at the different activities. And last but not least, here now marked in red, those coming from the NanoHarmony project, which is the guidance document of the determination of nanoparticle concentrations in biological samples, which is quite important, not only for the toxicokinetics, but also for some other in vivo studies. Then the recommendation for guidance on the adaptation of OECD TG 201, 202, and 203. And as well, the toxicokinetics now being mentioned, and the integrated in vitro approach for intestinal fate of orally ingested nanomaterials. The others also mentioned here are also ongoing projects. Some of them are related also to the Malta initiative, which is trying to push forward, as said in the beginning, to allow and enable the standards and test guidelines to be ready for use in hazard assessment, exposure assessment, risk assessment, for to to ensure a safe use of nanomaterials. So unluckily, I do not have such a nice list available at this point of time for what is actually planned with RISC-ON. I very, very much appreciate all the efforts and everything what was presented there from Maria in the last presentation before the break. And certainly it would be very good if we can come up with a combined list like here with what is actually foreseen. In addition to what is already ongoing here. One of the points being mentioned as a project proposal being just now at the WPMN level, it's a discussion on release. It's a document which is summarizing release testing methods and how they could be applied within a framework of release, which is ongoing, as said, at the WPMN level, and it will first stick to that level. And if you're interested on that one, you can certainly get in touch with me or with Anna Pohl from BAuA as well. So with that as summarizing actually what we have heard this morning, and I certainly did not go into the basics and what actually was presented, I would like to open the platform to the discussion or to raising issues which you think is important when dealing with the different test guidelines and guidance documents. Topics which could be here discussed are the presented developments in detail. And if Anna is prepared, we may discuss about the dustiness or the question being presented or coming in the chat this morning, but also some others may come up. Topic could also be the collaboration between the projects and with the OECD and nano safety cluster. What are your experiences? What do you think is important to take into consideration there? Possible cross-cutting issues. I mentioned one, which is always a solubility and dissolution rate, which we will have to keep in mind and to see how we can simplify it, make the equipment usable for multiple purposes, for multiple test guidelines, or not identified gaps or other points which you would like to raise. So my first question is to Anna. Did you find some time to have a look at the question?
Sophia. Sorry.
Sophia, sorry.
Anna Sophia, it's sort of correct.
Okay.
So Anna
yes.
Sophia.
Doesn't matter. It's fine. Well, I haven't prepared as such, but yeah, I went through the questions, and thanks a lot for giving us the opportunity to go through all these pendant questions and answers that came after Jack's presentation, and that went on the chat crazily. Thanks a lot to the audience for being so active. We are very glad to see that this topic is sort of popular and is raising your interest. Maybe I could start with a raised question from Fleming, which he was asking whether the dustiness can be related to the aerodynamic diameter. And this is absolutely right. We have seen that there is a correlation indeed with the dustiness and the aerodynamic diameter. Of course, there is a decrease of dustiness with an increase of the aerodynamic diameter. But we should also be aware that this dustiness, it's a complex series of interactions where other properties might enter in play. For example, the bulk density and also process-related parameters, the energy that is introduced in the system, in the powder, they might have a big role in the particles being generated in the air. And then there was another question from Neil on why do we need different dustiness methods for nanomaterials? And consequently, also Fleming raised an important point, as ideally we all would like to have standardized methods that are independent on the name of the material, either nano, either advanced, either in future multi-component complex materials. Surely we don't want different guidelines for all these groups of materials. I completely agree on having unique guidelines that can be applied for all materials independently on the name that we are attributing. The need of creating these new standards applicable for nano was because the previous standards, the SEN standards for conventional materials, they did not seem sufficient, so they could address the nanomaterials as such. They were not considering the number concentration, the number size distribution, which we believe that they are crucial to be considered in these methodologies. So it can properly describe the behavior of the material in the air and also their intrinsic characteristics. On top of these requirements, some of the previous methods developed for dustiness, they were requiring quite big amounts of mass being introduced. So these methods were some of these methods were optimized, and now they are requesting lower quantities for safer and cheaper purposes. I hope this was sort of cleared, properly answered. And then there was another interesting comment made by Frank, because he understood that dustiness is an intrinsic physical and chemical parameter. It's not. There are different influencing factors on dustiness, for example, the physical chemical properties of the material itself and the energy supplied, and also the environmental conditions that are applied during storage and testing. The value of the dustiness is exclusively specific for the material production and the process, and this is why we have available different dustiness test methods for nano. I hope this was also clarified. And then there was a last question made by Andre on whether there are limit values for dustiness measurements using the new standards, so we can better classify samples. I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but I think that he's referring to these ranking powders in terms of dustiness levels. They exist. There's some from the previous standards. There are some rankings for some methods. However, they have not been validated for nano, and this is something that we are trying to cover within this OECD work and GoFor Nano and NanoHarmony projects to try to develop specific method ranking schemes for different materials. And I think that's all. And with this, I don't know if there's more questions, and if I can do so, I'll be happy to reply.
I'm happy to open the platform to others to maybe add a question. I certainly have 2 points to raise with regard to your reply, but others first, please. And if Claus, you may have a look, because I do not see all the people, if there are some with their hands up, or
They should come up at the front, but I'm not seeing any either.
okay. So just one question. Aerodynamic diameter, which was the first one which you replied, means that you have an equipment actually using the aerodynamic diameter for selective sampling or selective analysis. So is this part of the envisaged test guideline, or for nanomaterials, or is it only number based, or what are the outcomes there? So
yeah, so this is a mandatory measurement for these new standards. The SEN new standards are requiring the determination of this aerodynamic diameter in terms of number based.
You said SEN standards? SEN or
the new SEN standards, the 17199,
right,
published last year.
And the test guideline?
And the test guideline will certainly mention these SEN standards, the new SEN standards, as standardized methods, and also include other methods that are currently not standardized, but they will also cover the measurement of these type of parameters.
Good.
So we try to harmonize along the test guideline.
the second question, and this is also what I had in mind, the lower quantity, so smaller devices for nanomaterials, so to allow testing with smaller quantities of test material. Is it also possible then not only to use these smaller devices, not only for nanomaterials, but also for other materials? Is that?
Yeah, that's correct. So in future, this might be applicable for these new advanced materials, hopefully more complex materials, but of course some advancements of these instrumentations also capable of measuring properly fibers. This is actually one of the gaps in the knowledge of this available instrumentation. Eventually, we can apply some modifications on the setup so we could cover these needs.
Yeah,
But
not only with the smaller devices new needs, but also to cover with the smaller devices what currently is covered with the larger devices. So so can it be used also for the other materials?
Yeah, for fibers is a bit different topic. And that's why we are developing specific SOPs, specific procedures to handle fibers and not granular near spherical particles.
Lovely, very good. There was one comment in the chat I saw, which is how by Ilse Thunmann, how about the EN 17199 standard for dustiness?
Yeah, this is the one that I was mentioning, the new standards published last year. So these are made to cover the nano specificity. So it's sort of an expansion of knowledge from the previous SEN standards, the 15055, and are adding on top of the mass-based dustiness level the recording of the online measurements in particle number, total particle number, and size distribution, and optionally microscopy and for further chemical analysis.
Very good.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't find how to raise my hand, so
no problem.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I was involved in the development of this standard, and I was wondering if you're going to expand on it further, but that was while I was looking for the precise number, and then I think you already partially answered my question.
Yeah, we'll not expand further because they are standardized. We'll mention them in the test guideline, but also cover other methods that are not standardized. For instance, the fluidizer that BAuA is very, very aware. And the Venturi device, which are some documentation quite well documented already in publications, and so we'll try to address them, even though of course we'll give priority to these standards because we'll have more labs being involved, so we'll have more representativeness of
and there are no developments, of course. Thank you.
Yeah,
lovely. I would then like to pass on Neil Hunt to the last question with regard maybe dustiness. Neil.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for the answering the questions. This is a question about dustiness, but also applies to all the other new standards coming out. It's a little bit related to the question I didn't do very well to Keld earlier. When you produce these new standards, is there going to be some way of understanding for a new user how they're better than what was previously in existence? I'm coming from a REACH registrants perspective who have to do the testing now, or should have done it in the last year or two, on whatever standards were available at the time. And now there are new standards coming about. So trying to understand whether I can understand what is perhaps weak about my existing data and whether I need to redo my studies, or whether there are aspects that perhaps I can say, actually, the data I have at the moment is good enough for registration. I'm aware that the regulators are the main people to answer this, but I'm just wondering from yourselves as people who are developing the standards, whether you're going to give information on how they're improvements on what's existing at the moment.
Do you want to answer, Anna-Sophia?
No, I mean, from the dustiness perspective, well, thanks a lot for raising this. From dustiness perspective, we are not going to develop new standards. We are going to mention the available standards and add on top already available knowledge on other methods that can be eventually standardized in future. And we will try to provide guidance on how to use these methodologies in a harmonized way, how to determine data, how to treat the generated dustiness data in a harmonized way. That's why we are collaborating with the eNanoMapper platform, so we can all add on and calculate. Eventually, there will be available macro scripts which will automatically determine the needed parameters required in the standards. So this will probably help in future to have an harmonized data sets and improve comparability of methods and ensure that this is all the knowledge is in one guidance.
So Neil, I think you made a very valid question on indirectly asking more or less what is the level between OECD and CEN and what are the obligations for you working for registration, for example, or for putting out data for regulatory purposes. And I think partially you already gave the answer in your question. Which method for a given regulatory obligation will be accepted by the regulators is set by the different regulations. The point for the OECD test guideline is that the OECD test guidelines are agreed upon by the governments of the different member countries, and that the mutual acceptance of data adhere to the test guidelines. So speaking this way, it means that, for example, you mentioned REACH for registration. You can as long use the methods you have been used and which were accepted before. But if you are using the methods of OECD and they can rely on and relate to other standards, then it is possible that it is also not only possible, but partially mandatory that it is also accepted in all the other member countries of the OECD when it was in accordance to the test guidelines and good laboratory practice. So maybe this answer will help you there. And then Neil, your hand is still up. So if there is no other point, I would like to open the floor to others. And Eric.
Yeah, maybe, sorry, maybe just add to what you just mentioned, Thomas, and also answering Neil to some extent. In general, new versions of OECD test guidelines start with a section of what is new in that specific version compared to an older version. So that should give you some information. I know for testiness that such an older version doesn't exist for OECD, as far as I know at least. So there it will be more a description of what it contains, and if it refers to other standards or test guidelines, that should give you an idea of how to refer back to older work or older data you might have. I think that's more or less the way forward, and clearly it's in the end the regulatory bodies like ECHA and EFSA and others who will see if they can still agree with what you delivered before, or if it needs to be updated, because I think it in REACH at least it's also somewhere indicated that it should be taking account of the latest developments and best practices and such.
Thank you for the additions. Any other questions or points you would like to raise? Cross-cutting issues? Otherwise, I would like to take the chance and may ask Maria Luisa. There were some comment from Simon Hoy, for example. It would be useful to always provide a comparison against the toxicity of an ionic metal under the same conditions where possible. And you gave some replies, and could you elaborate on this one as well as maybe on the EDTA question which was coming up in the chat?
Yeah, relate to the control. What I suggest is that because in the pretest, what we should avoid is any loss of stability of the nanoparticle. Normally, what you need is to expose your organism to the nanomaterial, not to the ion. So in this case, you don't need this control of ion. I think Susanna also answered something, and for the other question on net, I prefer that Nicolas Manier answer.
I did get the last one on what did
For
you mean for the EDTA?
For the EDTA, yes.
Okay, you would go to Nicolas Manier. Is he here to elaborate a little bit?
I think so. He was here. Nicolas? No, not now.
I think that the comment from Nicolas was that that question of EDTA was to be followed in tomorrow. Yeah. During the discussion, where he will present in more detail the EDTA aspect, I guess.
Okay, lovely.
So, do you want me to also explain what I meant with the ionic part?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Well, my answer on that was that we have a lot of information. For instance, in this case, in this particular case was zinc oxide, nanoparticles, where we can look at the bibliography in terms of the toxicity of the ionic counterparts. So with this, we can also infer, and understanding also the behavior of the nanoparticles in the media, which is also a request, if the toxicity is more related to the ionic fraction or not. So this is something that we can also add to this information when we are dealing with nanoparticles like these of zinc oxide, that we cannot avoid them to dissolve. In some cases, it's almost impossible, I guess.
I think
it's in some cases, of course.
A similar problem as you have sometimes with silver.
Yes.
The ionic species having an effect, and then to differentiate.
Yes.
What is the effect with regard to the particle?
Yeah, but in this case, not a control of the ion, is to know what is the effect of the ion and what is the effect of the nanoparticle. These are different tests. I mean, there are different tests for different substances.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, but in the for instance, zinc chloride, you will just look at the toxicity of zinc ions. And then if they are equal to the zinc oxide toxicity tests in terms of nanoparticles, this is something that you can already infer in some cases.
So using the comparison of soluble fraction of the particle and the effect, and compare it with the addition of the particle. Eric.
Yeah. Thanks. Just adding to this, clearly for the toxicity, you have these issues, whether it's the ion or the particle. But I think similar issues might occur when you're looking at the bioaccumulation, as Maria Louise is also doing, where you might want to separate also whether it's ions taken up or particles taken up, and especially with the measurement issues in the tissues. You probably will go for the total zinc or silver or whatever metal you have, and then it might also be useful to make that distinction. But to what extent that is important, I'm not sure yet. But it might help you also in that respect with getting an idea of what is actually taken up, whether it's particles or ions.
Yeah.
Okay,
but then also what happens inside the organism,
right?
It's soluble can get solid there, but yes. I think and I assume that the hand raised by Claus means that we have to stop here and come to the next session. So with that, thank you very much to everybody of you for the contribution. If you have open questions, please send the questions also by email, and we will answer those questions maybe in another webinar or directly to you, depending on the type of question and what is needed. And with this, thanks again, and I pass on to Claus.
Excellent. Thank you, Thomas. And we got all the issues covered that were outstanding for the sessions that don't have special meetings tomorrow. So I think we did pretty well there. Thank you, Thomas. The next speaker is Shareen from Swansea, who's going to run us through the nanomaterial hazard characterization SOPs that have been developed in patrols. So Shareen, if you want to share your slides. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Hopefully you should be seeing those now.
Yeah, in slide mode, we can see and hear you. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. And apologies if you see me moving a little bit. I'm in the office today and I'm actually being blinded, which is rather unusual by the sun. So I might try and just shift around a little bit. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all today during this meeting. And as you can see from the title of the slide here, I'm really going to focus on some of the SOPs that have been developed within the Patrols project, which has recently come to an end after quite a number of years. So it's gone rather quickly. But just to give you all a little bit of background on the Patrols project, for those of you that may not be aware of it. It started back in January of 2018, and Patrols ran for just short of 4 years. And the main focus of the project was around the development of a suite of hazard assessment tools that would allow an improvement in terms of being able to understand the consequences of exposure to long-term and low-dose nanomaterials. And this was with respect to both human and environmental systems. So the idea was about generating more reliable and realistic hazard testing system, coupled to evaluating more realistic exposure scenarios as well. And the idea was that these tools would provide information that could potentially better support regulatory risk decision making. So as I say, Patrols has come to an end now. We completed the project at the end of September of this year. And the purpose of today really was just to highlight some of the key outputs of the project that are there in terms of legacy methods and tools for other people to take forward and use in their own activities. So this slide and schematic just gives a very brief overview of essentially what we were developing within the project. But if you look at the middle panel here, essentially what we were trying to do was generate more realistic 3D and co-culture models of the human gut, liver, and lung. But in addition to that, we were also developing a suite of ecological testing tools, which again, in all cases, the methods were designed to specifically support repeated and extended exposure scenarios instead of your typical short pulse or 24-hour exposures. In addition to the model and the method, hazard characterization method development aspects, we also had a very comprehensive physicochemical characterization work package. But here the focus was very much on understanding the behavior of the materials in the test systems that we were utilizing. So essentially looking at whether or not the materials became transformed or altered in any way as a result of the exposure scenarios that we were putting them through. And then in parallel to that, we also had a work package that focused on collecting as much long-term and where possible chronic in vivo exposure data that was currently in the literature or available through other means. We did do a small amount of gap filling studies as well. And this was coupled to some AOP works in order to support building up a mechanistic understanding of the behavior of the materials within adverse outcome pathways. Then all of the in vitro, in vivo, and phys-chem data was fed into the computational work package that focused on developing a range of dose modeling as well as hazard prediction, in silico hazard prediction tools as well. Now, I don't have time to go through the breadth of what was actually actually generated in the project, but a key output was over 50 different SOPs that covered different aspects of the work that I've highlighted in the previous slide that related to each of the work packages that were ongoing. And in addition to providing the SOPs, the project also provided supporting data that illustrated how those SOPs could be applied as well. And that's something that's now open access, which I'll touch on in a couple of slides' time. Now, the next couple of slides are really just to give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the human hazard models that were developed in particular, but as I say, these are really just examples. So with the lung model, what we established was a co-culture of the lungs that could be, that the cells could be cultured in air liquid interface. And so in addition to establishing the co-culture, what we also spent some time evaluating was the exposure, the manner in which we exposed those cultures. And so given that when you breathe in particles, technically they're not really under a submerged liquid, we looked at evaluating a number of the different vitrocell systems with respect to delivering aerosolized nanoparticles to those co-culture models. And this was also put through an interlaboratory trial to be able to demonstrate that the method was transferable and not just restricted to an individual laboratory. Then when it came to the liver, we had multiple models that were developed here. We had models for healthy tissue as well as for a number of different diseased states. And the idea was that by having both of those situations, it would allow for comparison of nanomaterial exposure consequences in healthy versus sectors of the population that have got pre-existing disease. And with respect to these liver models, we'd established both culture systems that were developed from primary human hepatocytes, but also from human cell line-based hepatocytes as well, because the expense between the two systems is really quite different. And with the primary cells, it's difficult to generate gene tox data because the cells are non-dividing. And so the dividing cell population that cell line-based models offered gave us that capacity. Then with respect to our gastrointestinal models, once again, we had a couple of different situations here. These were all triple culture models that were included within the project. Both of the models contained CACO2 and HG29 mucus producing cells, but the difference between these two that are illustrated on the slide here is that this one contained THPs and could be cultured in both a stable versus an inflamed state to give an indication again of the response in a disease-based situation. And then we also had a model that incorporated Raji cells representing M cell formation. And with all of the culture systems that I've illustrated on these slides, they were capable of supporting a range of different hazard endpoint analyses, from cytotoxicity, gene tox, inflammatory response, gene expression-based analysis. So whilst a lot of effort went into the model development as well, we ensured and provided protocols for applying them with respect to hazard evaluations. Now, whilst the majority of the time within the project was very heavily spent on the development aspects, we also undertook a number of interlaboratory trials to demonstrate the reproducibility and transferability of the SOPs that we generated. We clearly couldn't do this with all of the SOPs, and so there was a select few that covered phys-chem characterization, the human lung, liver, and GI tract models, as well as ecotox testing systems as well. And so these did go through very small interlaboratory trials within the duration of the project. And as I said, these SOPs are now very much open access, so you can locate them on the Patrol's website. So the website, despite the fact the project is finished, is going to be maintained for a number of years. And so please feel free to go to the website and you can have a look at what's available. And essentially you just click on the Patrol's ID and the PDF of the SOP will pop up for you. There are a number of SOPs that aren't available yet because we're just waiting for publication to come through, but the vast majority of them are there and very much open access. So in terms of next steps, the one bottleneck that we typically have with many of the European projects is that we spend a lot of time in this development phase. We have these wonderful tools at the end, and the project finishes and we become a little bit stuck, which is a real shame, because there's a suite of next generation tools that are available, that are very useful, and it's how we keep the continuity going. I mean, certainly we're not at a point at where we can really look at OECD SPSFs with these models just yet, because there needs to be greater usage of them. We need more laboratories to use them and to apply the SOPs. The SOPs may need some further refinement as well, but essentially we can't do that within patrols. And so this is where, in terms of what we've been really trying to do in the last phase of the project, is make these SOPs as accessible as possible. And so we've held a number of training webinars, we've produced some videos to go alongside the SOPs, so it's not just a case of picking up a piece of paper and trying to work your way through the protocol. There is visual material available that's also there to help support people use these methods moving forward. These are also on the website, but clearly if there are any issues with people finding information that they need, then I'm certainly more than open to have people contact me, and I can connect them up with the relevant individuals that generated those SOPs. Another key thing that we've tried to do in order to ensure some project legacy is collaborating with other projects so that we can pass the information over as well. We've done this throughout the duration of patrols, really, at a number of different levels. And for example, within NanoHarmony, we've certainly been in dialogue with the team that are working on the intestinal models there. So we have some nice connections. But what we've also been doing is trying to pass the SOPs over to projects that started this year. So for example, Sunshine and Harmless, that started in January, and Ultra Harsh, which started in the summer. These are all utilizing some of the protocols that have been made available within patrols to try and expand their application beyond the project. So in terms of what the project has delivered, there's certainly a suite of tools there, but covering both human and environmental hazard. And I think the key thing is that these tools can be utilized for extended and repeated exposures as well. With respect to how these could fit into a regulatory framework, or this is something that we certainly regularly get asked. And whilst I alluded to the fact that we're not at the point at which we can write OECD test guidelines for these methods at the moment, it's a shame not to start using new approach methodologies when they become available. And I think this is something, again, that affects NAMs generally. So we certainly see these as tools that could be implemented as part of a safe and sustainable by design strategy, by implementing them and using them early within an innovation pipeline in order to support development of new nanomaterials and nano-based products. But the beauty here as well is that it can also help in terms of minimizing the need to test in animals, and that in turn is supporting the European chemicals, or some key aspects of the European chemical strategy moving forwards. So I hope I've stuck to time as much as possible. I'm keeping an eye on Claus to make sure that I don't get told off for going over. But to me. Perfect. So it just leaves me to say a very quick thank you to the patrols team, because they've essentially been responsible for generating much of what I've illustrated on the last few slides, and they really have been a fantastic collective to work with over the last few years. So thanks to them, and thanks to yourselves for your patience and attention. Excellent.
Thank you very much. That was a really nice summary of how you let go of your baby from the last 4 years. It's been hard. It's a hard place.
Strange.
Good, yeah. I don't know if there's any direct questions yet. There's stuff going on in the chat, but I think it's general chat. The bottleneck, it's a tough one. How do you leave it in a place where the next projects can pick it up and run with it? I'm hoping we can find Thomas getting us a bigger NanoHarmony to put all these bits into and widen the bottleneck at some point. Yuta, you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very nice overview. I was wondering, you mentioned there is a lot of information, helpful information there on the Patrol's website, but you also mentioned additionally you have created some video content to explain things, and this part I found especially helpful, but sometimes that gets lost over time when, for example, the website will expire eventually. So my question is, are you intending to publish this video content as well, so it will be there in the future?
Yes,
Thank you.
We have already done that. It's a really important point, actually. So we did produce a number of publications in the BAuA magazine, the BAuA journal, which is essentially a journal that allows you to publish methods alongside informative videos. So we have about 4 or 5 publications in BAuA that are linked to some of the protocols that actually went through the interlaboratory trials. So those are clearly always going to be available. Much of the other material we've actually put onto YouTube. So the link to YouTube is on the Patrol's website, but it's obviously more broadly available through YouTube as well. And so that's another way in which we've tried to increase the longevity in terms of the availability of the information.
Excellent, thank you. There's one other, I'm going to take chair's liberty here and let this go a bit longer. We got an hour for the next bit. So there's a question from Anna saying, were the in vitro models validated against in vivo data? And if so, what was the outcome?
So another really important question. We did struggle with this a little bit. We tried to do exactly that. And indeed, the methods or the particles that we used to benchmark, if you like, each of the models were specifically particles where we believed there to be in vivo data. So for the lung, we were able to do in vivo in vitro extrapolation. We ensured that the doses that were being used within the lung situation were relevant in terms of in vivo exposure. For the liver and the GI tract, it was actually much more difficult because when you look at the biokinetic studies, it's much more limited quantities that reach those organs. And indeed, many of the in vivo endpoints that had been analyzed in previous investigations didn't necessarily always line up with the endpoints that we were testing in vitro. So this was where we tried to do some gap filling, particularly for GI tract exposures. So there were some specific studies that were done to align the in vitro GI tract experiments with in vivo GI tract exposure-based data. The issue there was that it was negative in both situations. So whilst they did correlate, it wasn't really a positive result to facilitate the correlation. So in fact, what we did with all of the models was we also included chemical positive controls and chemical controls so that we had some form of comparison that we could make as well. Excellent.
Thank you very much. I don't see any further questions. So, oh, there we go. Flavia, today you can have it.
Hi, Shareen. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Very interesting also for our project on intestinal fat we are developing in NanoHarmony. My question is related to I imagine you used a repository of data in the project. Which system you used for your data?
The eNanomapper.
Okay.
Yeah, so we used eNanomapper both in terms of retrieving information, particularly for the in silico, the computational based work package, and then all of the data that we've generated within Patrols has been put into an eNanomapper instance. That data is actually currently available. Again, not all of it. Some of it is still under embargo because we're still in the process of publishing. But if there were data sets that people wanted early access to, then again, please please contact me, because we have already arranged for access to some of the patrols data at a much earlier stage where we've been able to.
Okay, thank you very much. This is an important point because you produced a lot of data, of course.
Yeah, and we're more than happy to share, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
That is how you pass your project into the teenage years. It's by those collaboration data sharing agreements before you fully make it available. Excellent. Thank you very much, Shareen. And I will hand over to Sean, who's going to share some slides that are going to try and sum up four workshops we had, workshop sessions we had yesterday, where we had split the regulators and industry up in separate rooms. We had a session early morning to capture the East, and then a repeat of run of this session in the afternoon to also capture what lies to the west of us. Europe was heavily present in both morning and afternoon meetings, but we did manage to cover all the way between Japan, Thailand, and the US as well. So Sean, I can see your screen starting to share, but I can't actually see it yet. I can see you, but you're muted.
Hi, sorry, Klaus, sorry everyone. My internet just did a little glitch there just as you were handing over. So just to maybe start with the caveat, although I've listed everyone's names against these slides, I take full responsibility for putting. I will ask to at the end.
Sean, it might be worth turning your camera off. We still can't see your slides. I'm struggling a little bit with the audio.
Okay, is that better, Klaus?
Yeah, I can see the slides now. Thank you.
Right, okay. I'll keep my camera off throughout then. I think that for some reason the internet seems to be playing up now this afternoon.
Lost your... Right. I can't see in the list of 88 whether Sean fell out completely.
Maybe it's better that somebody else shares his slide.
Yeah, I haven't got them though. Eric or Adrienne, have you got the most recent set?
I'm going to have a look, but I think Eric is also already in the meantime looking for the slides.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm not going to try because the meeting's all over.
Eric, can you share the slides?
Sorry, I was talking to a muted phone. Yeah, I'm looking for them, and I hope the latest version I have are indeed the latest slides.
Just a question in between, Eric and Anna, you are the ones having the presentation after the break, and I think the time slot is similar, 1 hour.
Yes.
So the question there would be, Eric and Anna, if you move forward to do it now, and then Sean could try to fix the problem as a suggestion to you, Klaus.
We can do that.
Unfortunately, I have to admit that Sean is also sharing my slides because we will use the Mentimeter option.
I can hear Sean.
I'm back now. So I've just switched. I'm using my phone's mobile data now, so hopefully that will be a little more secure. I really have apologized for the interruption. The internet's been absolutely fine up until the minute you handed it over to me. Right, I hope you can see my slides now.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. So I will indeed try to be really quick through these just to make sure that I can get through before my data runs out. So just a little bit of background about what we were doing yesterday, and just maybe a few caveats. This is a very immediate compilation of the sessions that we ran yesterday with industry and regulatory stakeholders. I would say by no means at the minute is it an exhaustive summary of the discussions we had yesterday. We asked the delegates various questions using Mentimeter, which does allow for immediate responses to be shared back to those audiences, but it's certainly not a full survey tool. And each question is almost a standalone question, so we can't necessarily relate people's responses back to previous responses. We did have follow-up discussions in all the sessions, and notes were taken of those, the outcomes and the opinions that were presented, and these in the fullness of time will be written up. The sessions themselves were all held under Chatham House rule, so no opinions have been attributed to individuals or organisations. And the final caveat is the summary presented here certainly does not necessarily reflect any official position or opinion of any of the organisations represented, and they are really just an interpretation of what we found in the sessions. So what was the aims of the workshop yesterday? Basically, it was to understand how two core stakeholder groups, that are regulators and industry, actually engage with OECD test guidelines and the guidance documents. We wanted to get people's opinions on how the process works and operates. We wanted to learn from people's experiences of working to develop or to use test guidelines to be able to identify best practice. And from that, to be able to identify possible improvements to the test guideline development process. And really, the final aim is to identify the improvements that can be made in the way test guidelines are used in regulatory compliance. So some simple questions and breaking them down into industry and regulators. We asked people the countries they're from, and as you can probably see in industry, there was certainly a lot of German organisations were there. In the regulator session, there was a lot of UK regulators there, but we had a relatively good split between the countries. It would have been nice, I think, if we could have had more non-European partners, but we had a substantial number of people from different countries. For the industry participants, we asked them what's the main business of their organisation using some very simple categories. So the majority were from either service providers or users of nanomaterials. We then had some research organisations, some people who describe themselves as other, and in some ways, somewhat surprisingly, we only had two organisations that describe themselves as nanomaterial producers. For the regulators, they were asked in the regulatory areas in which they worked. And as you can see, the vast majority of them, as anticipated, were working indeed in chemical regulations, but we also had regulators who are working in pesticides, cosmetics, and medicines. For the industry, we actually asked them slightly differently, for them to rank the order of importance of the main regulatory domains, the sort of impact on their organisation and the products and services they're producing. And I've split these down to the morning session and the afternoon session. But as you can see, again, as anticipated, the vast majority are going to be impacted by chemicals regulations. But there are people who are also impacted by pesticides, food, cosmetics, and indeed medicines. And I probably should have said at the start that we asked the same questions to some for both of the stakeholder groups, but we also had specific questions to each of the stakeholder groups. So for industry, we asked them about whether they thought the OECD test guideline program was either too fast or too slow. And as you can see, the trend here is people thinking it's rather too slow, with fewer people thinking that it's fast or too fast. The regulators were actually asked about how what sort of things would help speed up the development process of a new test guideline. And I've just extracted here some of the comments that were made to give you an idea of the sorts of items that are being raised. So more flexibility, more communication, more information sharing. In the fullness of time, again, we will combine a lot of these comments and categorize them so we can actually be able to present this data slightly in a more group form. Another question that we asked was who would be responsible for initiating a review of existing OECD test guideline to ensure its scope is relevant for a new material or a new innovation. As you can see here, again, splitting them between the sort of industry responses and the regulators' responses. In industry, it was very much felt that a representative industry body was the sort of #1 response, with other people thinking it should be OECD working groups or appropriate government agencies. Regulators thought it should be more from a regulatory body. But again, there was a more responses from regulators, or rather they used more of the categories, they suggested more of the categories than certainly industry did. Moving away from OECD test guidelines themselves, one of the questions that we asked was the extent that non-animal methods can be relied upon in risk assessment. And there's some good, I think, correlation here between the regulatory opinion and the industry opinion. So for the regulators, it was non-animal testing and animal testing will equally be needed, and very similar was the industry response. We've not had a chance to combine all of the information to be able to show it in a coherent fashion. So just extracting the sort of immediate responses that were gained, we asked industry a number of different statements about whether they strongly agreed or strongly disagreed with them, with graduations in between. And the statements we gave them were, any new regulation should only be introduced if there's an available test guideline. Regulators do not understand how industry works and often ask for data or tests we can't provide. Regulations do not keep up with the pace of innovation. And it'd be helpful if regulators gave more help of when to use a test guideline for regulatory compliance, and it would be useful if regulators gave more feedback on how to use a test guideline. And as you can see, the responses from industry was very much, they would obviously appreciate more help from regulators on when to use and how to use a test guideline. And they were varying towards the agree that regulation should only be introduced if there is an available test guideline to allow data to be generated. And for regulators, we again asked them a series of similar statements, and again asked them to whether they strongly agreed or strongly disagreed with those statements. So for regulators, we asked them the same question about whether regulation should only be introduced as an available test guideline. There was some split between the morning and the afternoon sessions over how much agreement there was with that statement. On the whole, they generally disagreed, that they thought that regulators do understand how industry works. There seems to be varying towards disagreement on regulators need data or tests that industry cannot provide. Regulations do not keep up with the pace of innovations, seems to be verging towards the agree. Regulators should be more frequently consulted by industry on regulatory compliance. Again, there seems to be some agreement there. Current existing regulations hamper responsible application of nanomaterials. That tends to be more trending towards the disagree. Between the two groups, the one thing that we can say, and you'll see this in some of the other slides as well, one of the opinions that seems to be coming out very strongly is there needs to be more consultation and discussion between all of the stakeholders. We asked both groups about OECD test guideline development and whether it should be more demand driven. And as you can see, between the industry and the regulators, there is an agreement here that they should be more demand driven, with industry strongly agreeing and in equal measures agreeing on that, and only regulators coming out with any disagreement with that statement. One of the interesting discussions that we've had is at which point would you expect an industry to start looking for a relevant test guideline in their development process of a new material or a new innovation. And so we asked this to both industry and the regulators, and we gave them a range of options from various stages of innovation, from sort of relatively low TRL levels to sort of high TRL level and market entry, and also options to say that they wouldn't look at all for a test guideline, or they'd rely upon a national regulator or a consultant to provide them that. And as you can see, industry is looking towards using test guide or looking for relevant test guidelines at sort of mid to later stages of development, so stage 3, stage 4. The regulator's response to the same question shows slightly more variation in responses. Again, it sort of comes out at sort of stage 5 of the sort of development process. Sorry, stage 3 of the development process is the more popular choice, but the regulators, there's more people suggesting that industry should be looking towards earlier stages than we certainly saw in responses from industry. But certainly neither in industry or regulators do people feel that there is no need for them to look for a test guideline at all. One of the questions that we asked, some of the questions we had textual responses from, as you can see on the screen. So one of the questions we asked was, how can industry comply with regulatory requirements if a test has not been validated? And from industry, it was better guidance, more willingness of regulators to accept test results from non-standard studies, providing feedback to regulatory agencies, what resulted in replies that they wanted to see data generated without guidelines, but potentially for that to be redone later. From regulators, again, there are certainly some crossovers here. So where they're suggesting using best available methods, using weight of evidence, but also some opinions that regulators have to be innovative, and also making sure that there's better communication. So it's in industry's best interests to ensure better communications. But again, some similar responses in the using best efforts could potentially be a higher risk strategy. On the question of how should test guideline development be sponsored, in some ways, some of the answers here were maybe surprising. So from industry, an opinion that the OECD has no money and have to rely upon member states to agree. And that was also reflected somewhat in the some of the regulators' opinions, that it's still very difficult for some national governments and national agencies to find the funding for them to participate. Cost sharing certainly comes out as being an opinion that's shared across both industry and regulators, and certainly some ideas that there needs to be combinations of funding available, so including government money and also maybe industry money as well. Looking at the what the future regulatory challenges may be for nanomaterials, but also for future nanomaterials, regulators were talking about complex multi-component materials, mixtures. Certainly the longer term hazards emerging from nanomaterials where there's not evidence available, reliable, reproducible data, lack of awareness, but also some issues around the application of the nano definition in Europe. Industry, again, we have this, the multiple definitions, the introduction of more complex multi-component materials. I think some of this might actually be a replication, but basically there is again very similar sort of evidence coming out between industry and regulators on the future challenges. And just to end, one of the questions that we asked was one of the suggested solutions to potentially speed up or make more efficient the development process for a test guideline was whether the OECD WNT should meet twice a year. And there was definitely agreement here between industry and regulators that that was potentially a good suggestion. And on that, I will finish. There are other questions that we asked where we're still looking and compiling some of the data. The session's only finished at 5 o'clock yesterday, so that really brief rushed compilation was something we've managed to pull together this morning. But we will have further results from this coming out.
Excellent. Thank you, Sean. Thank you for struggling through on the mobile phone. UK internet, eh? I think one of the interesting thing I thought from looking at these and when we look at it last night was that actually there's fair agreement about most of the main issues, including that there's more communication needed, and that one of the things that's really tricky is getting the techniques required into the process fast enough. Obviously, that has the issue of how does regulators know to trigger OECD to get something started, or the science to be built around test guidelines if they don't know what's in the development. So, Adrienne, you had some thoughts about how that gap could be filled, but also obviously feel free to comment on any of the other comparisons that you've seen now. The one that was interesting as well was how many times should WNT meet, and was it just us not finishing to the deadlines, or was it that there was only one deadline a year? You're muted, Adrienne.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here on my, I would say, alter ego, Adrienne Günther. So for those who know me, it's still Adrienne. I also saw a comment from Neil about this communication between regulators and industry, and I think how to make that operational. And that is, I think, something that needs further thinking and also is food for thought, to my opinion. But what we come across, at least in the Netherlands, is that people say, okay, when I do have a question and I want to talk to regulators, and especially in the chemicals arena, where's the door to knock on? So what is, is there an office, is there a help desk, or is there something else? And yeah, I think that is the point where we then are also in this. We can now make the observation, better communication or room for dialogue should be somewhere created. But the question then is where, and especially if you talk about OECD, do you have to go to Paris, or do you have to call to Paris or whatever, to an OECD office, or somewhere else? And yeah, especially for the SMEs, I think it needs to be kind of low profile, well, office or help desk. Another thing which we came across, I think, also in this communication aspect, was about confidence and confidentiality, about when you talk in early stages of your own innovations or work. yeah, how can you be sure that it can be talked about in a confidential way? And the only thing I can say about that is that we have given that quite some thought already in, for example, the NanoRec2 project, in which we came up with a concept, but I stress it's still a concept, so not operational, for trusted environments. And that is also now something taken up in a work group of the OECD on the safe innovation approach. So it's, yeah, let's say just ideas and starts to think it further. But yeah, I hope it's a start, and that also others will join us in how giving shape and whether it's a good idea or not. Yep.
Yeah. It would be interesting to hear other people commenting on it. Both Neil and Steffi has got comments around how do we get this demand drive of what are the next test guidelines that are needed for not, you know, being 5 years behind the innovation. So Neil and Steffi, I don't know whether you have ideas on how you would see that trusted environment being built.
Thank you, Klaus. I excuse me. Mine was actually a question. I seem to have gone into brain fog. I think I have COVID. I have no other symptoms, but my brain has gone mush.
Sorry to hear that.
I can't remember the question, but it was something about demand driven. Yeah. For me, it was not, and I have to apologize. Yeah, I was supposed to be in the afternoon session yesterday, but I had to step out. I'm just claiming that was the question that was phrased when I stepped out. For me, it wasn't entirely clear if the Mentimeter allowed a clear understanding as to who would phrase the demand and therefore whose demand it would be driven by. Because if it was industry answering the question on behalf of industry with a clear yes, and regulators answering that with a clear yes on behalf of the regulators or risk assessors, you get the same answer for essentially opposing ideas, right?
I think it was asked in the context of, do we need the OECD to be responding to demand or just responding to applications, if that makes sense. In terms of who was to initiate it was in one of the following questions, and that was what you saw presented a minute ago, I suppose. And that had a little bit more variability in it in terms of who should be the initiating party.
And if I may add on that, it was coming also from the idea that if we regard guidances and guidelines in the OECD as products to be given shape and let's say bringing them to a market where they are used, then we noticed that the connection between what's going on in the scientific arena and where method development takes place, and where also new techniques or technologies like AI or organs on a chip are now, well, at least investigated whether they can help us, for example, in non-animal testing. That for people working in those arenas, it's often not so clear on forehand that their knowledge and what they develop in the end can be used or can end up in these guidances and guidelines. And so you can imagine that regulators and you can imagine, yeah, for instance, at OECD, that they describe a kind of specifications for, well, what needs at least to be in there to have a product or a method that is helpful to be taken up in these guidances and guidelines. And we think also there a clear communication between all the actors from the scientific arena up to the full acceptance of these guidances and guidelines. That improvement there should also help to come to more efficient processes.
Yeah, okay. Steffi, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think that is exactly what we have been trying to set up for quite a while now. And although it might sound quite drastic to phrase it like that, but that is also why a lot of what what is in some projects touted as a standard operating procedure, because a number of labs got together and did a round robin and said this procedure works. Is not necessarily to be confused with something that could go for a test guideline, because you could essentially just completely miss the mark of is it needed or not. We have in a recent concept paper, which some of the people on this call here have been involved in developing, and it's not quite at a stage yet where we can allow everybody to comment, but we will. That has been developed between the working group B on of the nanosafety cluster and the working group G, which specifically looks at serving the needs of the risk assessors and governmental agencies and building a bridge between the research community and the governmental agencies. We've developed this idea of calling it a top-down approach, by which, to phrase it very simply, but also in a very challenging way, it basically puts the identification as to what is needed into the hands of the risk assessors, for saying, if you risk assessors want the information to be provided on this and you are asking for it as part of your regulatory request and your registration request, you tell us how to do the tests that are leading up to the data. And although this is simplified, but it essentially means that there needs to be an identification as to what needs to be done first, and everything else is nice to know. So that is, I think we have the GAFO Nano Risk Assessor Summit last December. No, sorry, second to last December. We're almost there again, aren't we? They did that very well in getting the risk assessors all around the table and saying, what do you still need to know? And there was surprisingly many, in inverted commas, complaints that the risk assessors had in basically saying, I'm still not quite sure what to do with this dossier, although it clearly says what we've been asking for. So, and this is, I think, this is what we describe as a top-down addressing of the issue.
Yeah, and there will be a second summit at the end of January, so invitations will be sent out to all. But it also stresses that the problem is not solved. So it's unfortunately we have to not only repeat the summit, but also, yeah, that there are many issues to tackle at the moment.
Okay, good. Neil, you want to come in?
I guess following up. Just you asked about sort of the question I asked about what type of communication. I would just be interested, maybe slightly cynical view, is whether both, I won't want to say sides, but both regulators and industry, what they probably don't want to see is the other people saying this is what you should do, without there being a 50-50. I have to say, having taken on the role of reading all the Caracal documents that come through from the Commission, I'm aware that the regulators receive an awful lot of information from industry, and NGOs quite often are completely contradictory to each other. So I have sympathy for the regulators, because they're probably seeing both sides of any argument and having to try and navigate quite a tight course amongst that, right across all regulations. But I do think this, I think this one side telling the other side what to do sounds like the top-down approach that Steffi was talking about, and the bottom-up approach sounds much more collaborative. So I'm aware that the Gov for Nano are doing this. I do know that Sunshine have got at least one part of the project looking at these safe spaces for communication, looking at that. So I think a lot of the projects, especially the new ones, are looking at this. So hopefully it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years.
And Neil, may I ask, do you think that is, let's say, also a matter of how detailed do you describe as a regulator what is needed or what needs to be done? Because I fully agree with you. We should perhaps get rid of that. From a regulatory point of view, you have to say, okay, this is exactly what you need to do. And for me, that's also given in by when you are dealing with innovations or innovative materials, we all are in a search, okay, what is, pivotal to know about this material, and how does it behave? So it's a kind of learning curve. We go together, industry and regulators. So then it's perhaps a bit silly to ask from regulators, okay, just tell me what to do, what we need to do exactly, because you ask another party who doesn't have the overview either. So I think I'm very much in favor of dialogues, and I know that sounds perhaps a little bit idealistic, but especially if you take into account the by design, then that addresses more that you both are in this in this learning curve and in searching for the best option. But you do need to agree both, of course, on this is what we call safe, and these are on a higher level the safety criteria we need to deal with and we need to address, and going for, let's say, the least hazard, that is, I think, something you can have the dialogue about.
From a personal perspective, with asking, especially around the nanomaterials and the updates to REACH, the regulators they don't tend to tell you, especially the competent authorities and ECHA as well, don't tend to tell you exactly what you have to do. And quite often it's a case of, well, these are the basic things you have to go supply. How you do it is up to you as an industry, which sometimes can be a bit frustrating for industry from my perspective, because you're a little bit concerned that, okay, I'm going to do what I think I should do, but if I turn out to be wrong in a year's time, do I have to redo all my work? But you do have that flexibility to go and take your own approach, but perhaps what would help is perhaps a little bit more reassurance that if you could run past what this is, okay, I can do how I want to do because it's my unique product, but I'm going to run it past you. Is this okay? And to get some reassurance that you're not just going off and then in a year's time, someone's going to make an evaluation and go, no, you did it wrong. You have to do an entirely different type of study because you end up paying twice. That's from my perspective. So once again, that might be just me, and maybe the rest of industry doesn't find that, but I think it is open to that. You're not directly, regulators are not saying you must do this exactly like this. That's not the case. They are giving registrants freedom to do what they want. It's just, personally speaking, you just need a little bit of reassurance that the regulators sort of agree with the approach you're taking.
I know this from the drug development area, and we wrote also a publication in the NanoReg2 about it, and that is in the medicines development, whether you have, let's say, a very innovative product or whether you think you have an innovative method to prove some safety aspects, there is room to ask for what they call a technical advice with EMA, and you have to pay for that advice. So that's perhaps some of a hurdle for especially the smaller companies. But at least you can exchange views, and it's not with a guarantee that if you do it like that, okay, in the end you will be granted with your market permission, but at least you have an exchange of views, and you know from each other, okay, what are your, let's say, your chances that that approach, as you foresee, that is acceptable for risk assessors or for regulators. So I think such a mechanism is lacking for the chemicals, for example.
I think it was one of the interesting conversations yesterday, because to me, as a consumer and a scientist, neither as an industrialist or a regulator, I obviously want the best science to be brought to bear on whether something is safe or not, which means if we find out something needs reassessing because there was something we missed and we didn't have a technique for, then obviously it should be done. And to me, there's only one person you can charge for that piece of evidence. It's not going to be nice when you've invested and you've put your product on the market to have to redo it, just like they've seen with the neonic pesticides, but it does happen. Hopefully for consumption products and human use, we won't find out by having to look for population effects before we go and do reassessments. I think to try and do something slightly different with the last 15 minutes, It goes towards the same bit of how do we optimize how the WNMP and the WNT works and what they work with, and trying to kind of neutralize that communication part. One of the suggestions was that there should somehow be a voting system for which were the priority bits that should be accepted into the OECD system on the basis of this demand knowledge of which bits are the most important ones. It's not necessarily the ones that are the most ready that are the most important to go in and take the time that is available by the people working in the OECD working groups and expert groups. So one suggestion was that just like Shareen showed before, we have a load of test SOPs, fairly standardized, obviously not ring tested or potentially partially ring tested, ready, that they should be presented somewhere in a neutral forum where both industry and regulators could then have a say on, oh yeah, that's the one we need to push forward faster than the others. That's bits we can work with. The bit about foreseeing which standards we need to develop the science to deliver, that's much harder. But there's plenty of people here that work on the OECD group. So some of them said, well, I could definitely not do 2 meetings a year, and it wouldn't speed things up anyway, because the bit that's really slowing things down is the commenting rounds and getting the paperwork ready. So having 2 deadlines a year would only really speed things up for the people that just miss a deadline, or at the WNT annual meeting find out that there's a few bits that they need to complete, and then they have to wait a year, whereas completing that bit actually won't take them a year, but it will be a year until it can be reassessed. So if there's any comments on whether such a neutral forum of prioritizing the science-based options for going into the system would be useful, that would be interesting to hear. But also, if there's anybody who has any ideas of how we get to the techniques that we haven't yet started on, how do we get to write a proposal in NanoHarmony 2 that says, actually, these are the standards that we haven't even started on yet. There wasn't much comment on that.
May I ask, or may I add a little bit to that? In my presentation yesterday during the workshops, I tried to sketch also the need for speeding up the process and this prioritization. And that is, to my opinion, quite driven by the Green Deal, the ambitions that were in there, and the goals in, for example, the chemical strategy, where also endpoints like for immunotox or endocrine disruption or some other endpoints that were mentioned, it was clearly stated we need standardized methods. And I was wondering, well, perhaps people also in this audience, how do you think, can we afford ourselves to take the same pace of the OECD guideline development as we had before, as in the Green Deal, for example, the development of new materials is seen as quite crucial to establish the innovations needed to address all, and then I come for the next part, the climate change challenges and other challenges that are mentioned in this Green Deal. So that there is, let's say, for me, a kind of shift in this modern innovation policy, as it's called. It's much more driven by, we have challenges we face as a whole world, and we have in Europe some ambitions to address these goals, and therefore innovations, and especially also the development of new materials, is very much needed. On the other hand, standards and guidances and guidelines like in the OECD are pivotal to get these materials in place, that they are safe and that products are sustainable. and perhaps also that we not perhaps, but that we also address the circularity, of course. So it's a lot of things going on, but I think yeah, the field has the force field has a little bit changed, and the demand for driving up the speed of this process also is changing.
Yeah, no, I think that is right. It goes towards what Juta's also hinting at, and we discussed yesterday, that needs to be more close connections between the measurement standards of the OECD and the more kind of performance related standards, if you want, of ISO, where things like, you know, proof of circularity and sustainability is going to be something that needs to sit between the two. We have lots of comments now. Neil's had a go. I'm going to give it to Sean and then do the others in order and get back to Neil. Sean first.
Yeah, something which I think also came out yesterday, which kind of plays into this a lot as well. Having new test guidelines in some ways is irrelevant if there isn't anybody there who can actually run the test guidelines for industry. And there was some discussion, certainly in the industry session, around the sometimes difficulty of finding an organisation, either a CRO or indeed even the university, that's actually able to run the test guideline for industry. So in one sense, it's not just about creating new test guidelines, it's actually about being able to actively use them as well. So I think that's maybe another consideration and certainly another driver for industry.
Yeah, yeah. You'd like to think supply and demand ran hand in hand, but it depends on how expensive supply is, whether demand actually persists. Cool. Thomas?
Do you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I can't switch on my video, I just noticed. Okay, so the question for me was more or less related to what was said by Adrienne. There is a demand which you were showing, and maybe an increasing demand here in this case coming from Europe. But on the other hand, speeding up the process or looking into the bottleneck, what we were looking also the possibility, what can we actually do to speed up the process? What efforts are necessary and what is possible? And I think here we noticed during the discussion also that we do not have too many options of increasing the speed or to improve the process at the same time while involving all the different stakeholders and giving the chance to the political level actually to go through their process steps as well. So the question then remains, how can we fulfill the demands in a way that is going and using sensible the resources we have? And that is not an easy question.
No, I agree with you. And I think yesterday, at least in the regulators workshop, the input was merely, I think, that they saw that the time limiting step was in the commenting process and commenting rounds. So that gave already quite some insight, but I think it's worthwhile also to investigate further whether that's, let's say, really the overall picture, to consult perhaps more stakeholders or in a more broader scope. But even then, yeah, is there enough speed to gain? And otherwise, I hardly dare to say it, but perhaps some other approaches are needed. But that is, you know, really a transition in itself if you go over to such processes, and whether that's beneficial. But I think it was a little bit touched upon perhaps by Claus, but perhaps we need to go over to these kind of intermediate things. You know, if you think we have support that certain approaches or methods or things are acceptable, with the knowledge we have at this moment, and we are all aware that full validation isn't in place yet, but this is the best we can do for now, that perhaps some room is needed for that, but with a clear statement that it's not the same as the guidances and guidelines we are used to. But I think we need to be creative in our thoughts to at least try to catch up, because I think otherwise we will lag behind even more than we are already doing to this space of innovation. And the great risk is that we create legacies we all try to avoid as hard as we can, but it takes so much time then, and in the meantime the world needs to go on. And I think there's also a part in governments and in policy arenas where industries are really pushed to bring their products to market. Please bring these solar cells and these batteries and all these kind of things we need. So it's also a kind of ambivalent message we go out. So yeah, it's not an easy thing to tackle, but I think the time just for observations, as yesterday also was mentioned yesterday by Miriam, is over. We need to make things operational, and we can't state over and over, okay, the process needs to speed up. Now it's really time to make something out of it.
Yeah, I agree. Neil?
It's just like you're talking about which areas do you think maybe need new or will receive more attention in the next few years. I'm aware I'm talking to a whole room of toxicologists, and I might be talking complete rubbish here, but obviously endocrine disruption is a big thing. It's coming through the chemical strategy for sustainability, and a lot of the standardized methods that are being discussed here are more mechanistic, investigating mechanisms as much as apical endpoints, and those are going to be required to define an endocrine disruptor according to the proposed definitions. But I'm not aware of seeing much work being done on whether these standardized tests for endocrine disruptors are applicable to nanomaterials or not. So someone might be able to say, yes, they already are, we're already looking at it. If not, then that might be a new area over the next few years.
Yeah, and in response to that, Neil, I'm also working in a new partnership program in the Horizon Europe about chemicals risk assessment. It's called PARC, so perhaps many of you are also aware of that. And it indeed is something we need to give further thoughts, but also to take action on. What has happened for the nanomaterials was there was already, let's say, a lot in place in guidances and guidelines for chemicals, and then we saw just took the position, okay, is this applicable for nanomaterials, and if not, okay, how to adapt. But especially for these new areas, we need to make a choice. Okay, are we waiting, let's say, what will be developed in PARC, and then we, slow behind, or how can we make it happen that we do that at a similar pace and in good collaboration with each other? That's also, I think, a major point of attention.
Yeah. Good. Jutta, it looks like you're going to be last taking us up to coffee.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Following your discussion, I thought there is one part of the industry we sometimes tend to forget. So you have the industry which are supplying or producing nanomaterials or then advanced and smarter materials and the downstream products of that. But we have this huge section of the industry who are doing analytical testing. They're either developing new analytical standards and tests, or they're doing that on a regular basis. So because there is at least from my point of view, seldom an association for that kind of industry section. We tend to forget that, especially if we are talking about the regulatory aspects, and sometimes I have the feeling their input could help us as well from the regulatory point of view, as well as from the industry point of view, meaning the producer part.
It addresses also a point raised during the Research and Innovation Days of the Commission, I think 2 years in a row, that we actually need to give shape to the word co-creation. I think for many of us, it's something you say, okay, I know someone else in another stakeholder group, and sometimes we work together. But this really supports indeed that statement from the Commission that co-creation and working towards the same goals wherever possible is now really pivotal to reach for the ambitions as laid down in all the strategies, but also to make it operational.
Cool. Good. I'm going to be brave and let Richard Handy do it, but you are playing with everybody's 15 minutes of coffee.
I shall be very, very brief, Claus. I've just been thinking of how we can increase the ability of contract labs and people in industry to be involved at the OECD, and of course the main problem is time and money for them to be there, and you know they're trying to run a business. So I wondered if maybe the OECD could change how it arranges the delegation, so it isn't just the rep from the government department and the sort of policy admin person and their technical scientist type person coming along, but there was some scope for some funded spaces from people for industry to attend the meeting regardless of what country they were from. Or even something at national level where it was a pot of money just for those individuals. So
I think it's definitely something the expert group should take into account, because it's really at that level where we have to make sure we don't overdevelop something that is then so complex it can't be implemented.
That's right. We can
maybe be right, but it might be impossible.
And maybe set terms of reference at the beginning of the task of making a new guidance document that it shouldn't take more than this long to do it, and it shouldn't cost more than this amount of money. Yeah. And then the CROs can tell us what that should be. Yeah.
Good, excellent. I like that. On that note, I'm going to release you all for 15 minutes worth of coffee. Well, 13 minutes worth of coffee. We'll be back at past and go through the last session that we have there in terms of how we are looking at a survey for breaking down those barriers that we've just been talked about. So 13 minutes, and I'll see you back here for the last bit. Thank you.